Did we sleep together last night, Silas? Those 7 words hung in the air of Silas Thompson's modest kitchen like a guillotine blade. His boss, Beatrice Morrison, the woman he'd respected for 3 years, the executive who'd always treated him fairly despite his complicated schedule as a single father, stood before him in his late wife's borrowed clothes, her vibrant red dress from the night before replaced by something that carried memories. Her face was pale and uncertain, one hand pressed against her mouth in shock. Silas felt his world begin to crumble as he stood there holding the pieces of a shattered coffee mug. How could one simple act of kindness lead to this moment that would change everything? If you're wondering how a decent man's life could be turned upside down by helping someone in need, and how a single question could shatter 3 years of emotional isolation, then you need to hear this story that explores the unexpected consequences of our everyday choices. 24 hours earlier, Silas had been focused on just making it through another Friday. The quarterly property analysis reports were due. His 7-year-old daughter Alara had her dance recital that evening, and he was running on 4 hours of sleep. The life of a single dad working as a real estate analyst in New Jersey wasn't glamorous, but he'd found his rhythm in the 3 years since Sarah's death. The office was buzzing with anticipation for the company's annual achievement celebration. As a mid-level analyst, Silas had helped secure a major commercial property deal that quarter, but celebrations weren't on his mind. He needed to finish his work, pick up Alara from her after-school program, get her to the recital, and somehow manage to be both mother and father for another day. "Thompson, you're coming tonight, right?" Trevor from the marketing department called across the office floor. "Open bar at the downtown loft. The whole executive team will be there." Silas shook his head without looking up from his computer. "Can't. Alara's dance recital." Trevor rolled his eyes. "Man, you need to live a little. Being a dad doesn't mean your life is over." But to Silas, being Alara's dad meant his old life was over, and that was perfectly fine. She was all that mattered now. His phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Gable, their reliable neighbor who sometimes watched Alara. "Don't worry about rushing. Taking Alara for ice cream after school. We'll have her ready for recital by 6. For the first time that day, Silas breathed easier. Maybe he could stop by the celebration for just an hour. Beatrice Morrison, his direct supervisor, had championed his flexible schedule when he'd needed it most after Sarah's passing. The least he could do was show his face and thank her for her continued support. But what Silas discovered at that party would lead to a morning conversation that would force him to confront a truth he'd buried so deep he'd forgotten it existed. A question that would reveal how completely he'd erased himself as a man in favor of being the perfect employee and devoted father. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you just to know how far our story is going. The downtown loft was packed with colleagues when Silas arrived. Music pulsed through the converted industrial space as he navigated through groups of people already loosened by alcohol and the freedom of Friday evening. He spotted Beatrice near the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking uncharacteristically relaxed in that striking red wrap dress instead of her usual tailored business suits. Her hair fell loose around her shoulders, a stark contrast to the severe bun she typically wore. "Silas, you made it," she called, waving him over with a smile that seemed brighter than usual. At 42, Beatrice was only a few years older than Silas, but her position as regional director put her well above him in the company hierarchy. She'd always maintained professional boundaries while being understanding of his situation as a single parent. "Just for a bit," he explained, checking his watch. "Alara's recital is at 7. "The famous Alara," Beatrice smiled, though something seemed forced about it. "I feel like I know her from all your stories. How old is she now?" 7 going on 17, Silas laughed. She informed me this morning that my choice of breakfast cereal was tragically basic. Beatrice's laugh was genuine, but Silas noticed the slight sway in her posture. Several empty cocktail glasses sat on the nearby table. Smart girl. Takes after her dad. She signaled the bartender. One drink before you go? To celebrate landing the Westridge account. One drink turned into conversation about the company's expansion plans, Beatrice's vision for the department, and eventually more personal matters. Silas rarely spoke about Sarah with colleagues, but something about the evening, perhaps the relief of completing a difficult quarter or the unusual chance to socialize, loosened his guard. It'll be 3 years next month, he found himself saying. Sometimes I still catch myself setting 2 coffee cups in the morning. Beatrice's eyes softened, and for a moment, the executive mask slipped entirely. I can't imagine. You've done an amazing job with Alara, though. Sarah would be proud. That's when Silas noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she reached for another drink. Are you all right, Beatrice? Her composure cracked like ice under pressure. Fine, she said too quickly, too loudly. Just celebrating. She drained her glass and set it down harder than necessary. The divorce was finalized yesterday. Silas hadn't known she was going through a divorce. Beatrice was intensely private about her personal life, maintaining the image of the unshakable executive who had everything under control. I should probably call you a cab, Silas said gently, reaching for his phone. No. Her response was sharp, drawing glances from nearby colleagues. She lowered her voice, but her words came out slurred. I mean, I'm fine. I just need some air. But when she took a step toward the exit, her ankle rolled in those expensive heels, and Silas caught her elbow to steady her. The confident woman who commanded boardrooms was suddenly vulnerable, leaning against him for support. Let me help you outside, he insisted. We'll get you a ride home. The cool evening air seemed to make things worse rather than better. Beatrice leaned heavily against the brick wall of the building, her professional demeanor completely dissolved. 12 years, she said softly, staring at nothing. 12 years, and he left me for his 26-year-old assistant. Such a cliché, right? She laughed bitterly. I devoted everything to my career because he said he supported my ambitions. Turns out he was just waiting for someone who wouldn't outshine him. Silas didn't know what to say. This was a side of Beatrice he'd never seen, vulnerable, hurt, human. No cabs, she mumbled when he pulled out his phone again. Don't want anyone from the office to see me like this. Silas checked his watch. 6:40. Alara would be looking for him in the audience soon. Her face bright with excitement in that pink tutu she'd been practicing in for weeks. His heart raced with an impossible choice. Leave his boss in a potentially dangerous situation, or miss his daughter's performance that she'd been preparing for months. He made a quick decision and called Mrs. Gable. I'm so sorry, he explained when she answered. Work emergency. Can you possibly take Alara to the recital? I'll meet you there if I can. Mrs. Gable, bless her heart, agreed immediately. Don't worry, dear. I'll record everything if you're late. Alara will understand. But Silas knew Alara wouldn't understand. She was 7 years old, and in her world, Daddy had promised to be there. He was breaking that promise for a woman who, despite being his boss, was essentially a stranger when it came to personal matters. With that settled, Silas helped Beatrice into his car. I'll take you home, he said. Where do you live? Beatrice gave an address in Westfield, an upscale neighborhood about 20 minutes away. As Silas drove through the Friday evening traffic, she grew quieter, staring out the window with unfocused eyes. I'm sorry, she finally said. This is so unprofessional. It's okay, Silas assured her, though his phone kept buzzing with texts he couldn't check while driving. Everyone has rough days. When they reached her address, an elegant colonial house with a manicured front garden that spoke of success and careful planning, Beatrice fumbled with her small purse. "I can't find my keys," she said, panic creeping into her voice. "They must be. I don't know where they are." Silas helped her search through the contents of her purse, but the keys weren't there. They checked her pockets, retraced their steps to the car, but found nothing. "Could they be at the bar?" he suggested. Tears welled in Beatrice's eyes, the first time Silas had ever seen this composed woman even close to crying. "I can't go back there. Everyone will see me like this." Silas checked his phone. 7:15. Ilara's recital had not only started, it was probably halfway finished. Mrs. Gable had sent 3 texts with photos of Ilara in her costume, looking around for her father in the audience. He made another decision that would change both their lives forever. "Come on," he said gently. "You can stay at my place tonight. Sleep it off and we'll figure out the key situation in the morning." The drive to his modest 2-bedroom house was quiet except for Beatrice's occasional directions and apologies. Silas lived in a middle-class neighborhood where the houses were smaller, the lawns less perfect, but where children rode bikes in the streets and neighbors knew each other's names. Inside, his home told the story of a man raising a daughter alone. Ilara's artwork covered the refrigerator, her school projects cluttered the coffee table, and photos of her activities lined the mantelpiece. But notably absent were recent photos of Silas himself, as if he'd disappeared from his own life, existing only as Ilara's father and Beatrice's reliable employee. "Your guest room is upstairs," Silas said, leading Beatrice up the narrow staircase. "Bathrooms right across the hall. There are some clothes in the dresser if you need something more comfortable." What he didn't mention was that the clothes belonged to Sarah, items he couldn't bring himself to donate but couldn't bear to see every day. They'd been stored in the guest room dresser for 3 years, waiting for a purpose he never expected to find. Beatrice nodded gratefully and disappeared into the room. Silas heard the shower running as he sat in his living room, staring at his phone. Mrs. Gable had sent a final text. "Ilara was beautiful. Don't worry. She understands Daddy had to help someone." Video attached. He watched his daughter's performance on the small screen, her graceful movements and beaming smile, and felt something crack inside his chest. Not just guilt, but a recognition of how completely he'd structured his life around avoiding any situation that might require him to choose between his responsibilities. The next morning, Silas woke early as always and started coffee. The routine was automatic. Check emails, review the day's schedule, prepare Ilara's breakfast. But when he heard footsteps on the stairs, it wasn't his daughter's light patter. Beatrice appeared in the kitchen doorway, and Silas nearly dropped the coffee pot. She was wearing one of Sarah's old sweaters, a soft blue cardigan that his wife had loved on weekend mornings, and a pair of jeans that fit surprisingly well. Her hair was damp from the shower, her makeup washed away, and she looked younger, more vulnerable than he'd ever seen her. "I hope it's okay," she said, gesturing to the clothes. "Mine were not in great shape." "Of course," Silas managed, though seeing another woman in Sarah's clothes created a strange ache in his chest. They sat at his small kitchen table, surrounded by the domestic chaos of single parenthood. Ilara's cereal bowl from the morning before sat in the sink. Her backpack hung on a chair, ready for Saturday activities. The refrigerator displayed her latest art project, a family portrait that showed just her and Daddy, no mommy figure anywhere. Beatrice seemed to take in all these details as they shared coffee and the awkward intimacy of morning after conversation. She looked more human than he'd ever seen her, Not the polished executive who commanded respect in boardrooms, but a woman who'd been hurt and was trying to piece herself back together. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for last night, for not letting me do something stupid. Anyone would have." Silas started, but Beatrice cut him off. "No, they wouldn't have. Most people would have called a cab and walked away. You missed your daughter's recital for someone who's basically a stranger to you outside of work." That's when the question came, cutting through the morning stillness like a blade through silk. "Did we sleep together last night, Silas?" The coffee mug slipped from his fingers, shattering against the kitchen floor. Coffee splashed across the linoleum, and ceramic pieces scattered under the table. But Silas barely noticed. He was staring at Beatrice, at the genuine uncertainty in her eyes, at the way her hand had flown to cover her mouth as if she could take the words back. "No," he said firmly, his voice steadier than he felt. "No, we didn't. You slept in the guest room. I slept in my own bed. Nothing happened." Relief flooded Beatrice's face, but something else flickered there too. Something that looked almost like disappointment before she could hide it. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I couldn't remember everything clearly, and when I woke up in different clothes." But as Silas knelt to clean up the broken mug, he realized something had broken inside him too. For 3 years, he'd been so focused on being the reliable employee, the devoted father, the man who never caused problems or made waves, that he'd forgotten he was also just a man. A man who might be desired, who might be seen as more than just a convenient solution to other people's problems. The question hadn't just been about what happened the night before. It had been about whether he was still visible as anything other than a helpful tool. And for the first time in 3 years, Silas wondered if there might be room in his carefully controlled life for someone unexpected. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you just to know how far our story is going. The drive to Beatrice's elegant colonial house was filled with tense silence, broken only by her occasional directions and whispered apologies. Silas kept checking his phone at red lights, 7:10, 7:15, 7:20. Each minute that passed was another moment of Alara's performance he was missing, another promise broken. When they arrived at her manicured front lawn, Beatrice fumbled through her small designer purse with increasingly frantic movements. "I can't find my keys," she said, her voice rising with panic. "They have to be here somewhere." Silas helped her dump the contents onto his dashboard: lipstick, breath mints, business cards, her phone, but no keys. They checked every pocket of her red dress, searched the car seats, retraced their steps to the curb. "Could they still be at the bar?" Silas suggested gently. Tears welled in Beatrice's eyes, the first time he'd ever seen this composed woman even close to crying. "I can't go back there," she whispered. "Everyone will see me like this. Trevor, the marketing team, everyone will know I fell apart." Silas looked at her swaying slightly against his car, mascara smudged beneath her eyes, the confident executive reduced to someone who couldn't even stand straight. His phone buzzed again. Another text from Mrs. Gable with a photo of Alara in her pink tutu, looking around the audience for her father. He made a decision that surprised even him. "You're coming home with me," he said firmly. "You can sleep this off, and we'll figure out the keys tomorrow." Beatrice started to protest, but Silas was already opening the passenger door. "It's not a discussion. You're not safe to be alone right now, and I'm not leaving you on your doorstep." The 15-minute drive to his modest neighborhood felt like crossing between two different worlds. From Beatrice's upscale Westfield address with its perfect lawns and luxury cars, to his middle-class street where children's bikes lay scattered on driveways and neighbors actually knew each other's names. His small two-bedroom house told the story of a man raising a daughter alone. The moment they walked inside, Alara's presence was everywhere. Her artwork covering the refrigerator, dance shoes by the front door, a half-finished puzzle on the coffee table. Photos of her school events and activities lined the mantelpiece, but notably absent were any recent pictures of Silas himself, as if he'd disappeared from his own life. "The guest room is upstairs," Silas said, leading Beatrice up the narrow staircase. "Bathrooms across the hall. There are some clothes in the dresser if you need something more comfortable." What he didn't mention was that the clothes had belonged to Sarah. Items he couldn't bring himself to donate but couldn't bear to see every day. They'd been stored in that dresser for 3 years, waiting for a purpose he never expected to find. Beatrice nodded gratefully and disappeared behind the guest room door. Silas heard the shower running as he grabbed his keys again. If he drove fast, he might catch the last few minutes of Alara's recital. He made it to the elementary school auditorium just as the final number was ending. Through the back doors, he could see his daughter on stage in her pink tutu, arms gracefully extended, her face glowing with pure joy. Mrs. Gable spotted him and waved from the third row, pointing to where she'd saved his seat. But Silas couldn't bring himself to walk down that aisle, to take the seat that had been empty for most of his daughter's performance. Instead, he stood in the back, watching Alara curtsy with the other dancers, seeing her scan the audience one more time looking for him. After the show, Alara ran to Mrs. Gable with excitement, chattering about the dance moves and the costumes. When she finally spotted Silas approaching, her smile faltered just slightly. "Daddy, did you see me dance?" "I saw the end," he said, kneeling to hug her. "You were beautiful, sweetheart." "Where were you for the beginning part?" she asked with 7-year-old directness. Silas felt Mrs. Gable's understanding eyes on him as he struggled for an answer. "I had to help someone at work who needed help getting home safely." Alara processed this with the seriousness she applied to all of life's complexities. "Like when I help Emma when she falls down at recess?" "Exactly like that." She seemed satisfied with this explanation, but Silas carried the weight of another broken promise as they drove home. Mrs. Gable had offered to keep Alara for a sleepover, sensing somehow that Silas needed the evening to himself. Back at his house, he found Beatrice asleep in the guest room, still wearing her red dress but with her shoes kicked off and her hair spread across Sarah's old pillows. He closed the door quietly and spent the rest of the evening cleaning up, doing laundry, and trying not to think about the strange intimacy of having another woman sleeping in his house for the first time since Sarah's death. Morning came with its usual routine: coffee, shower, checking emails. But when Silas heard footsteps on the stairs, it wasn't Alara's light patter. He nearly dropped the coffee pot when Beatrice appeared in the kitchen doorway. She was wearing one of Sarah's old cardigans, a soft blue one that his wife had loved for weekend mornings, and a pair of jeans that fit surprisingly well. Her hair was damp from the shower, her executive makeup washed away, and she looked younger, more vulnerable than he'd ever seen her. "I hope this is okay," she said, gesturing to the borrowed clothes. "Mine were not in great shape." "Of course," Silas managed, though seeing another woman in Sarah's clothes created a strange ache in his chest. Just then, Alara bounded into the kitchen, still in her pajamas, and stopped short when she saw the unfamiliar woman sitting at their table. "Alara, this is Ms. Morrison from Daddy's work," Silas said quickly. "She needed a place to stay last night." Beatrice smiled warmly at the little girl. "You must be the famous dancer I've heard so much about. I'm sorry I missed your recital." "That's okay," Alara said with characteristic generosity. "Daddy missed most of it too because he was helping you." The comment hung in the air with uncomfortable truth. Beatrice's face flushed with embarrassment, but Alara was already moving on, chattering about her dance moves while pouring cereal into her bowl. "Can you do a pirouette?" Alara asked Beatrice. "I haven't tried in about 30 years, Beatrice laughed. "But I think I remember," to Silas's amazement. His polished, professional boss stood up in his kitchen and attempted a wobbly pirouette in Sarah's cardigan and bare feet. Alara giggled and demonstrated the proper technique, and suddenly his kitchen was filled with a warmth it hadn't known in years. They shared breakfast around his small table, surrounded by the comfortable chaos of single parenthood. Alara's cereal bowl, her backpack ready for Saturday activities, her latest art project on the refrigerator, a family portrait showing just her and Daddy. Beatrice seemed to take in all these details, this glimpse into a life so different from her executive world of boardrooms and quarterly reports. She looked more human than he'd ever seen her, not the commanding director who made million-dollar decisions, but a woman who'd been hurt and was trying to piece herself back together. After Alara finished breakfast and ran upstairs to get dressed, an awkward quiet settled between the adults. Beatrice stared into her coffee cup, and Silas found himself really looking at her for the first time. Not as his boss, not as a professional obligation, but as a woman sitting in his kitchen wearing his dead wife's clothes. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for last night, for not letting me do something I'd regret." "Anyone would have done the same thing," Silas started, but Beatrice shook her head. "No, they wouldn't have. Most people would have called a cab and walked away. You missed your daughter's recital for someone who's essentially a stranger outside of work." The observation stung because it was true. He had chosen to help her over being there for Alara, and he wasn't entirely sure why. That's when she asked the question that would change everything. "Did we sleep together last night, Silas?" The coffee mug slipped from his fingers, shattering against the kitchen floor. Coffee splashed across the linoleum, ceramic pieces scattering under the table. But Silas barely noticed the mess. He was staring at Beatrice, at the genuine uncertainty in her eyes, at the way her hand had flown to cover her mouth as if she could take the words back. "No," he said firmly, his voice steadier than he felt. "No, we didn't. You slept in the guest room. I slept in my own bed. Nothing happened." Relief flooded Beatrice's face, but something else flickered there too. Something that looked almost like disappointment before she could hide it. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I couldn't remember everything clearly, and when I woke up in different clothes, in a strange house." But as Silas knelt to clean up the broken mug, he realized something had broken inside him too. For 3 years, he'd been so focused on being the reliable employee, the devoted father, the man who never caused problems or made waves, that he'd forgotten he was also just a man. A man who might be desired, who might be seen as more than a helpful solution to other people's problems. The question hadn't just been about what happened the night before. It had been about whether anyone could see him as something other than a convenient tool. Dependable Silas, who would always do the right thing, always put others first, always fade into the background of his own life. "I should go," Beatrice said, standing abruptly. "This is already too complicated." But Silas looked up from the broken ceramic pieces and said something that surprised them both. "What if I don't want uncomplicated anymore?" 6 months later, Beatrice was promoted to regional vice president, a position that should have created even more distance between them professionally. Instead, on the Friday afternoon of her promotion announcement, Silas received a text from her personal phone, the first non-work communication they'd ever shared. "Celebrating tonight. No alcohol involved, I promise. Want to join me and Alara for ice cream?" The message sat on his phone for an hour while he stared at it, understanding that this was an invitation to step outside the careful boundaries they'd maintained, to acknowledge that something had shifted between them that morning in his kitchen. He texted back, "Alara would love that. So would I." The ice cream shop was neutral territory, filled with families and children's laughter. Alara immediately took charge, explaining to Beatrice the proper way to eat a sundae and detailing every flavor she'd ever tried. Beatrice listened with the same attention she gave quarterly reports, asking serious questions about the merits of chocolate versus vanilla. "She likes you," Alara announced with 7-year-old bluntness as Beatrice walked them to their car afterward. "I like her too," Beatrice said, but her eyes were on Silas when she said it. That ice cream date led to dinner the following weekend. Then a Saturday afternoon at the park where Beatrice pushed Alara on the swings while Silas watched this composed executive become genuinely animated explaining the physics of momentum to his daughter. Slowly, carefully, they built something neither had expected to find. Beatrice began joining them for Alara's soccer games, sitting in the stands like any other parent. Silas started attending company social events, no longer the widower who always had somewhere else to be. The morning Beatrice asked if he'd ever considered that his heart might have room for more love, Silas realized he'd been holding his breath for 3 years, waiting for permission to live again. 1 year later, on a Saturday morning in his kitchen, the same kitchen where she'd asked that devastating question, Beatrice wore a simple white dress while Alara scattered rose petals and misses. Gable cried happy tears. The ceremony was small, just family and close friends. But when Silas slipped the ring onto Beatrice's finger, he felt like he was stepping back into his own life after years of watching it from the sidelines. "Did you ever think?" Beatrice whispered as they danced to music playing from Alara's tablet in their living room. "That helping a drunk woman get home safely would lead to this?" Silas looked around at his house, now truly a home again. Alara was spinning in her flower girl dress. Mrs. Gable was boxing up leftover cake, and his wife, was in his arms wearing Sarah's blue cardigan over her wedding dress. "I thought my story was over," he said softly. "Turns out it was just waiting for the next chapter to begin." Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you just to know how far our story is going.